So you are attending the Creating Places for People in Nature. The session will discuss the importance of conservation-minded municipal ordinances, how to craft and administer a successful subdivision ordinance through a variety of perspectives. And we have several speakers for this session. One is Rick Trellis from Natural Lands. He's a landscape architect with 20 years of professional experience helping municipalities with plans, landscape architecture, open space planning, trail design, master park planning, etc. We also have Rachel Griffith, and Rachel has recently been named the Director of Sustainability or Sustainability Director for Chester County Planning Commission. And previously she was working with the Trails and Open Space at the county. She's been there for 5 years. She has been working with a lot of municipalities and community organizations and the public to forward initiatives that improve our environment, enhance our active transportation, and help with clean energy systems. So registered also as a landscape architect, Rachel will begin our session after I introduce two more individuals. We have Maggie Dobbs, who is the Director of Planning and Zoning and the Assistant Township Manager for Westtown Township. She joined Westtown in 2021 after serving in the Montgomery County Planning Commission for years, where she worked with a variety of municipalities doing writing for subdivision ordinances, assisted municipalities with grants, doing parks and other public improvement projects, and comprehensive plans and land development reviews. We also have a supervisor on our team. She's from East Coventry. This is Karen Nocella. She's been there since she initiated and worked with the township to create an open space bond. And she is very much into conservation and moving a lot of projects along that impact the quality of life of her community. She's also sits on the Parks, Recreation and Conservation Committee, and she's the chair of the Open Space Committee. So as we move along, since we have a very small group, if you have any questions, put them in chat. You also have an unmute mute button. If you want to join in the conversations, ask some questions, please do so. Just be respectful to kind of find that right time during the speakers' presentations. So let's begin with Rachel. Go for it.
Hello, good evening. I'm just going to turn my light on so I'm not quite so dark. Thanks for having me here tonight. I'm going to share my screen. Give me just a second to get it up and running. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides, and Carol, let me know if you can't for some reason. But like I said, I'm Rachel Griffith. I'm the Sustainability Director at the Chester County Planning Commission. And our topic this evening is people and nature. And you may not automatically think subdivisions when you think people and nature, but hopefully after this evening you will. So our presentation this evening is about cluster subdivisions, different types of cluster subdivisions, and how they can be beneficial for people in nature, and also how to really get what you want out of a cluster subdivision ordinance. So as we all know, open space is a really big part of Chester County and what makes us unique and special. And this bar chart shows all the different types of preserved open space that make up our network of open space in the county. And you can see that agricultural easements and lands that are eased by land trusts are kind of account for about half of that land. But a significant amount, 11%, is made up of land that's preserved within subdivisions that's owned and operated by HOAs, homeowners associations. So it's over 17,000 acres. And so it's a significant component of our open space network. So what is a cluster subdivision? It's basically what it sounds like. These two graphics kind of compare and contrast a conventional subdivision that spreads the lots out over the entire tract to a cluster subdivision where the lots are smaller and they're clustered together. And there's a lot of benefits from developing this way. There's enhanced opportunities for open space preservation. A lot of this tract is preserved and untouched as opposed to on this tract. There's more opportunities for environmental protection, for buffering streams, protecting forests and wetlands, things like that. There's more opportunities for providing recreation for the folks who live in the development. And it also provides for more design flexibility than conventional subdivisions, which can be beneficial for municipalities and for developers. And there's also economic benefits, right? So there's a lot more road in the conventional option, and therefore utilities, if there's public utilities, than in the cluster option. So they're generally less expensive to develop than the conventional subdivision. And you can also do, because there's this flexible design, it's better for creating neighborhoods and places where people can interact with each other and really feel like part of a community as opposed to feeling more spread out. There's obvious benefits for energy conservation. You're using less space, you're not driving your car as much. There's reduced maintenance costs for all of those same reasons, reduced stormwater costs because the open space is managing the stormwater and you're not creating as much impervious surface. And also with cluster subdivisions, many municipalities choose to have design standards that go along with these ordinances. So you can really kind of regulate the design and make sure that it looks good in the end. So oftentimes you hear cluster subdivision and conservation subdivision used synonymously. But I think, and I think Rick thinks that he's going to speak next, that there's a difference. And there's lots of reasons to create a cluster subdivision that we just talked about. But when you're really prioritizing the open space and environmental aspects of it, and you're requiring more open space to be set aside, generally 50% and more of the tract is considered a conservation subdivision. Those are really what we call conservation subdivisions. And so less than 50% preserved open space or prioritizing some of these other benefits, those are really your cluster subdivisions. So there's a lot of different types of cluster subdivisions in Chester County, and I thought it might be helpful just to provide some of the breadth of the ordinances that municipalities have that regulate cluster subdivisions. So the map on the right shows all of the zoning districts in Chester County that permit cluster subdivisions. So you can see that over half of municipalities have some kind of cluster provision in their zoning ordinance. And the red line that has the sort of haze within it are the growth areas. So where we at the Planning Commission anticipate future growth would and should be directed. And so you see there are cluster zoning districts that allow for cluster within those growth areas, but we generally see it outside of growth areas where you really want to preserve open space and protect natural resources the most. And this map is an interactive map that's on our website, and this is the link to get there below if you want to check it out. So within those municipalities, there are 59 zoning districts with cluster provisions. The Planning Commission did an inventory of all this last year. And so you can either permit the cluster subdivision by right. So, if you're developing in a certain zoning district, that it's just one of the uses that you can do. But a little bit less than half require it to go through the conditional use process. And that gives the supervisors just a little bit more control over what results from the design. And then a small percentage, there's a mix. So maybe, over 25 units need to go through conditional use, but otherwise it's by right or something like that. And then the vast majority of these zoning districts where cluster is permitted, it's voluntary. So it's basically an option, just one option that you can choose. You can choose to do a conventional development, or you can choose to do this open space design option. And some municipalities choose to make it mandatory after a certain number of dwelling units, like if it's more than 15 or 20 dwelling units, it has to be a cluster subdivision. Or if the tract is above a certain acreage, then it has to be a cluster subdivision. And then we just had one ordinance that required cluster subdivision. And so, we talked about the percentage of open space and how that kind of determines if it's a cluster subdivision or a conservation subdivision, and really helps define what the design parameters are and the design priorities. And so our inventory ranged from requiring 25% open space, which really was around urban centers like near Spring City and Oxford had 25%, and then 75% was sort of the upper limits of what we saw in terms of required open space. But the average and the most common that we see is around 50%. And these are all just straight percentages, but some of them are 50% of the developable land area, and some are 50% of the total tract area. So developable land area being a much smaller area generally. If there's a site that has woodlands or a floodplain, that not developable part is removed from the total tract, and what's remaining is the developable area. And then so 50% of that would need to be preserved. So that's much more stringent. So cluster subdivisions can be done really well and can be designed in a way that they're really great places to live and great places to have in your community and really fit well within the fabric of the community. And can benefit habitat and environmental resources, but they can also be not so much that way. And it really depends on the strength of a municipality's ordinance. And Maggie is going to talk a little bit more about that later. But recognizing this, when cluster subdivisions started becoming more popular in the early 2000s, Chester County Planning Commission developed a cluster subdivision design guide for municipalities who were developing cluster subdivision ordinances. And we identified a number of design elements that are listed here that really play into the overall success of a cluster subdivision. And so we kind of defined the elements and talked about what the considerations are, and then provided some model ordinance language. And things have changed in the past 20 years in terms of how these subdivisions are seen and what some of the constraints and opportunities are now. So we're updating the cluster guide, and you can look for it in June of this year. And it used to be a booklet, a 100-page booklet, and we're putting it on the web this time. So we think it'll be a little bit more accessible that way. But look for that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rick, who's going to talk more about a special kind of conservation subdivision.
Thank you, Rachel. And actually, I'll start by saying I really like seeing that last slide that you had up that recognizes the importance of design standards and things like that, because so many of the old cluster ordinances from, like you said, 15, 20, 25 years ago, sort of just said, preserve some more open space and here's a density bonus. And that was it. So it is really good to see that the county is taking into account more of those important design elements and sort of community making elements. Okay, can you guys see my natural lands intro screen?
Yes, right.
Great. So I'm Rick Tralles from Natural Lands. And I'm figuring out how to make my slides advance. There we go. Hopefully you know us from our many Chester County preserves, but we also do municipal consulting. I'm happily appointed East Coventry Township's planning consultant. I've also, over the last few years, worked with West Vincent, East Whiteland, East Goshen, and a handful of other Chester County municipalities. But today I'm going to talk about growing greener conservation subdivisions. This is a photo of a guy named Randall Arendt. Randall worked for Natural Lands around the 90s and 2000s, and he literally wrote the book on conservation subdivisions. I like to highlight the subtitle of the book, though, Putting Conservation into Local Plans and Ordinances, because we can't just wish for open space to appear in our communities. We have to actually write it into our codes. We always say that if your subdivision regulations require plans that look like the ones on the left, everything chopped up into individual lots, then that's what you'll get. If you'd prefer your subdivisions to have some open space, some shared community land, then you need to write your regulations to require them. So how do we do that? Through growing greener conservation by design. I'm going to quickly run through this sample site. Imagine this as a typical 2-acre zoning district in your community. If this were 36 acres, you'd get about 18 dwelling units. And in a conventional subdivision, all of the natural resources, the woodlands in green, the streams and the little dotted lines in the woodlands, would all get chopped up into individual lots. And you'd have these big 2-acre lots. We like to flip the process around using the 4-step design process. We first identify the most important open space to preserve, the most important natural resources. So in this case, everything that's in green, the woodlands, the steep slopes, the wetlands, an important tree out in the middle of the meadow are all identified in the first step, delineating open space. Secondly, we locate where houses should go. And in this case, it's the open and flat land. In step 3, we locate infrastructure, drawing in roads, drawing in trails. Finally, in step 4, we draw in the lot lines. And you should notice that these lots are significantly smaller than the lots in that first conventional plan that I showed. Basically, the premise of a conservation subdivision is that any land that is steep or wet, riparian buffers, wetlands, ponds, steep slopes are required to be preserved in open space. And then 50% of the buildable land also has to be preserved in open space. So essentially, we're taking a 2-acre lot, cutting it down into about a 1-acre lot or smaller, and putting the rest of that land into open space. So here again, you can see each of these sites is 36 acres. Each of these sites contains 18 dwelling units, but the growing greener site also contains about 20 acres of open space. There's precedent for this kind of design. Golf course communities have been built this way for decades. The homes are clustered and they surround a golf course. We think we can do better than golf courses for open space. We can do forests and meadows and wetlands and streams. We think we can do better than communities like this. This is a typical 2-acre community. I think it's really interesting to look at some of these lots and see where the land is actually being used. If you look at the houses, some of them have a pool close to the house. Some of them, like one over here on the left side of the screen, has a small fenced-in backyard, and the rest of the yard is just open. People aren't using a whole 2 acres anymore, but they are mowing and mowing and mowing, using fossil fuels, spending their money and wasting their time. We'd much rather see plans that look like this. This is an example from Lower Merion Township. The plan was put together by Glack and Thomas Panzak. But notice that through the center of the site, there's a stream with associated floodplains and buffers. There's a pond at the bottom of the stream, and that's all preserved in open space. Out at the main intersection, they've created a meadow and some passive recreation area. Much of the woodlands has also been conserved in open space. The homes are clustered tightly together, conserving open space for this community, for all of these community members to use, rather than chopping up the natural resources on individual lots. Now I'm going to show you a Chester County example. This is in London Grove Township. We're going to take a look at a subdivision called Lambourne Hunt. In the early 2000s and late 90s, when development was booming, London Grove Township extended sewer and suddenly had more new development on the books than they could handle. They were about to double their population and they had no parks. They adopted growing greener ordinances in order to start conserving open space quickly as land was developed. So I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but good. This part here is Lambourne Hunt, and you can see that they clustered the homes along a few spines, left the stream corridors in open space. You can see other subdivisions that followed to the north and south, also preserving open space, which connects to the Lambourne Hunt open space. The story is late in the process, the developer and the township negotiated that the developer would donate part of the open space to the township to create a park. Other surrounding landowners also conserved land with easements or donated land, and they started to build a greenway through the southern part of their township. People often hear small lots and they get concerned that we're talking about little tiny houses. We're not. You can still, with good architecture and good designers, you can still do pretty large houses on many growing greener conservation subdivisions. Benefits include open space right outside of your front door, trails through the open space, trails to connect different communities. When you put your water resources in open space, it gives townships and HOAs and developers a chance to reforest and buffer streams. This is a photo from about 25 years ago, maybe, when the subdivision was brand new. And this is a more recent photo. So they're rebuilding their buffers on their streams, protecting their water quality. I already mentioned trails can be run through all this open space, connecting communities. So I mentioned this greenway that they're building. Here's the open space from Lambourne Hunt, a number of other easements and donations to the south. This, I believe, is Franklin Township, who have also connected the greenway and done land conservation to extend this greenway network even further. And here's a snapshot of what that park looks like now. It was, when the development was built, just open ag fields that needed to be reclaimed. The township has recently built a really terrific trail network there. They put in pavilions, a small playground, pretty large dog park, community gardens. They've really made the most of that long ago open space donation. We think anybody watching should do this. Many of your neighbors already have. So thank you. That's conservation subdivision in a nutshell. Many similarities to the cluster subdivisions that Rachel was talking about. A few differences, primarily the amount of open space that we require. And now I think either Carol or Karen was going to lead into a bit of discussion.
Thank you, Rick. Maggie or Karen, either one. Who's next?
I think Karen's next if she's ready.
So I'm happy to go next unless Karen was ready.
So
When it,
is it unmuted now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, you can hear me.
We can hear you,
Yes.
we can't see you.
Oh.
If you unmute, if you allow screen or yourself, your video, whatever, you'll be fine.
Okay, start my video. Okay, here I am.
There you are.
Here I am. Yeah, I was pretty excited when this concept came to East Coventry Township. My only regrets are that I didn't do it sooner, because there's so many chunks of land that we used to ride through. And now there's all these houses on huge lots, and we're not allowed to ride through there anymore. And of course, we ride down the road, and you're right, Rick, no one is outside. No one's playing outside, nothing's going on. And I'm thinking that would have been a perfect place to do this type of zoning. But my question is, and I think you might have helped me understand this. Why are we going to growing greener instead of the cluster? And I think you actually alluded a little bit to the fact that once we do get this adopted, we will get rid of cluster zoning. Is that true, or I'm not understanding?
I think that's true, Karen. I think that growing greener is a good tool for East Coventry in part because you're still an agricultural community. You're
Right.
close to Pottstown. You're starting to see some spillover from Pottstown. But preserving 50+% of a site in open space can really allow you to maintain vast meadows. There is actually some opportunity to keep farming on some sites. That amount of open space can really help keep your community's character. You can keep your development pushed in away from roads.
Mm.
And you have right now the underlying zoning that works with growing greener. Much of your community is in a 2-acre zoning district with no water and sewer. That's a good starting point because it allows us to basically cut lots down to 1 acre and still be able to fit a well, a septic system, a backup septic system, and East Coventry's stormwater management requirements exceed Chester County's stormwater management requirements. And your lots still allow us to also do on-lot stormwater management, even with all the required separation distances. And in your other districts, where you have smaller lots to begin with, you have water and or sewer, which also allows us to shrink lots and do more open space. And that
My other question too is, and of course my concern, because I'm all about trails and connecting all these trails, and we've started an excellent system. If we then go ahead and adopt growing greener, can we mandate that whoever's building in that area has to not only do the open space, but can we make them do the trails too and make the connections? How's that work?
This is a excellent question, and it is a little tricky too. I'm not an attorney, so everyone's solicitors may approach this a little differently, but my understanding is that a municipality cannot require a developer to make any part of their development completely open to the public. However, almost no developer comes in and does a plan that meets every requirement and doesn't need any waivers. We've seen a good planning commission and a good board of supervisors can often negotiate for that permission. In East Coventry, for instance, you guys recently had I think it's 80 townhouses development, Whispering Woods, that has open space and trails built in the open space. And your ordinance requires trails to be built. You can do that. And the developer needed some waivers, and it was a long discussion, and the planning commission said, hey, we're going to make these trails public, right? And the developer kind of said, whatever you want.
Okay, okay,
And so you got that really good public trail connection through Whispering Woods.
okay.
And honestly too, Karen, you know, I think a lot of developers are starting to get it. Trails isn't a dirty word like it was 15 years ago. Developers are realizing that people want to live places where they can walk, where their kids can walk to school. And they're starting to offer some of these connections on their own.
Okay, yeah, I think, I personally, but this is just me, if I was going to buy a house somewhere, I would think that it would enhance the property value if I knew I could just walk out my back door and start walking on a walking trail. So I don't know if that's a selling point for these developers saying, hey, look, people are going to want to come and buy these houses because they know there's X amount of open space, and these people know that they can just walk all through the community. So to me, it's a good selling point. I don't know if we can, buy it, but I think they are buying into it now. People do want to go out and recreate, and we really saw that during the pandemic too.
It definitely is a selling point. And a few years ago, Chester County did a report that you probably remember, Karen, called the Return on Environment,
Yes.
which quantified the economic benefits of open space. And the report found
Mhm.
that your house being located near a trail added like $11,000 to the property value,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
something similar actually, I think it was much more than that, being located next to protected open space.
Mhm. Yeah. Yep. Thanks, Rick. Thank Rachel.
Thank you. Maggie, do you want to pick it up from here?
Sure thing. So, let me get my slides up. All right, so are you all seeing the slides?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Are you seeing the full slide or the like the notes page?
The notes page.
I have multiple screens. That's fine.
I think you're fine. Just move with it.
All right,
I
we'll
noticed
just leave this
earlier
up.
they couldn't get rid of that double screen either.
All right, so to build off of what Rick and Rachel were saying, and Karen, thank you for your great question, because I'm actually going to touch a little bit about some of the trails and how you can actually get that into your ordinances. I've had the great pleasure of working with a number of municipalities over the past many years and evaluating those ordinances, and being in the position of a zoning officer and previously as a planning consultant. I've seen a lot of different ways that ordinances are written. So I wanted to touch a little bit about how to actually then execute on some of these ideals and goals that we've been seeing. So obviously through the growing greener concepts and cluster subdivisions, we have a lot of really great model language that we can use to build our ordinances to achieve the desired development results that we want to see in our communities. But I know a lot of municipalities have ordinances in place already, but may not be achieving those goals that they actually set out to achieve. So the ordinance is in place, but for some reason there are maybe some loopholes or some specifics that aren't really getting built in the way that they want to. And so there's always a good opportunity to evaluate your ordinance and consider some of the things that I've listed out here to see if you can modify your ordinances to strengthen it to actually achieve those goals. So the first thing is pretty basic, is just to actually identify what your goals are. Sometimes I think that gets a little bit lost in trying to be too creative with some of these ordinances, or trying to kind of capture too many scenarios in the ordinances. So I think it's the first thing, if you're setting out and writing an ordinance for the first time for a cluster subdivision or conservation subdivision, or if you're evaluating an existing ordinance, I really think it's important to just take a step back and say, what what are our goals, and be clear. I think if I'm going to emphasize anything is that you need to be very definitive, specific, and measurable in outlining your goals, and then specific, definitive, and measurable in the actual language that you use in your ordinances. So identifying the goals here. So what actually are your preservation outcomes? Are you setting out to achieve open space? Are you setting out to achieve that open space for parks, like in the London Grove example? Are you seeking to just preserve natural resources for water quality, for resiliency planning, for some other reason like that? So be very upfront with yourself and your municipality's goals. You know, take a look at your comprehensive plan, see what's been listed there for some development goals. There's always some sort of plan that you can kind of lean on that has helped to define what that is. So take a step back and just identify that, and then actually map it out. So to kind of build off of Rick's kind of 4-step process, if we just take kind of that 3-step process first before adding those homes, take a look at your entire municipality and say, here are where we have natural resources, here's where we have development, and here's where we have still opportunities for open space. And identify those greenway corridors, identify where we have contiguous stands of woodlands, identify where the stream corridors go, identify where we have wetlands, and target those areas that have those contiguous, unfragmented open space areas and target them for development, or I'm sorry, target them for preservation. So it's always really good to just visualize these things too. So I'm a huge proponent of mapping it out. If you have GIS services, you can just add all of your layers for all of your resource protection features that you want to highlight. And it's very clear at that point to see where all of those areas are, where you can have the most bang for your buck in terms of taking those open space areas and targeting them for preservation. You can also pursue an official map. This is, if anyone's not familiar with it, this is a process through the MPC where a municipality can adopt an official map, which actually lays out certain things that the municipality intends to construct essentially. So this is a great opportunity to identify your proposed trail alignments for hiking trails, biking trails, often on-street trail networks, to say, this is where we want to have them. So then you can essentially take your map with all of your greenway corridors, take your trails, where you're going to tie them together, how you're going to tie neighborhoods to neighborhoods, neighborhoods to community destinations like schools or shopping centers, places of worship, and then put it all together into a map so that you can point to it. And that is going to be a definitive and measurable thing that you can say, this is the development, this is the open space, and these are the points of connectivity we're trying to make. And then the third thing I wanted to talk about was to play developer and just try to break your own ordinance. So this has been a really helpful technique that I have used in the past, and I find it extraordinarily helpful because you may not really fully understand how your ordinances actually play out in real life, because you write them thinking, this is going to be great. We're going to preserve 50, 60% open space, and we're limiting density to, whatever your, X number of dwelling units per acre. But you're looking at it from kind of a blank map, but you're not really looking at it from a perspective of an actual parcel in real life. So the best thing to do is to take a parcel, an actual parcel in your municipality, and apply your code to it and say, if I were playing developer and I'm trying to maximize my profit, what can I do that still meets the basic rules of and regulations of your ordinance? And what can I get from this? How can I develop this property? And honestly, just try to hack it. Just kind of reverse engineer your whole ordinance and try to be as ruthless as you can and maximize development as much as you can, because that's where you're going to see where the limitations are that you've built in of your open space preservation components. And then that gives you an idea of where to strengthen them based on those weak points. Because if there's ambiguity in your code and you don't specify specifically, you say, we want 60% open space. All right, well, 60% open space can be, if it's pockets in people's backyards, then that still technically meets the code requirements, but it doesn't meet the intent. But it's really hard if a development meets the regulations, but doesn't meet the intent. They still meet the regulations. So there's a lot less that you can do as a municipality to kind of push back against that. Obviously, there are opportunities to have those conversations with the developers to say, well, if you need these waivers, we're going to kind of have that conversation back and forth. But it's really, really important, I think, to just actually see yourself, before development comes in, how your development or how your ordinance would actually play out. And then consider as well that oversight. And I think Rachel touched on this a little bit earlier, but there's different ways that you can have oversight. So it could be a by right, it could be a conditional use. So this is just where you're going to want to take an opportunity to think about how much oversight you want out of your ordinance in terms of how it ends up getting structured. So that will also impact the development review process once you have a development in front of you. And then just a couple quick things more about kind of diving into the ordinance language specifics. So again, those measurable design guidelines are absolutely critical to creating a functional and suitable ordinance to your purposes. So you need to have clear requirements for what qualifies as open space. Rick also touched on this a little bit, and Rachel, where you have the open space, but you take away things that are under, floodplains or wetlands, and then of your developable land, then you also preserve, 50% of that or whatever your percentage is. It's really critical that you have whatever counts and whatever does not count towards open space very clearly defined in your code. So you want to be able to say all of those things that count or all of the things that are discounted or excluded from your net area. So if we're taking a look at net versus gross, and we're taking out things like the wetlands, floodplains, woodlands, steep slopes, and then even things that have infrastructure. So things that are part of roadway acts or roadway easements or roadway rights of way, things that are in as part of stormwater management. If those are all going to be excluded, it needs to be very clear in your ordinance that those get taken off the top. And then everything that's left over, again, either gross or net, then that is where your percentage comes in. And then once you've identified kind of the numbers, then what you need to do in your open space guidelines is to say very specifically, not just you need to preserve 50% open space, but where that open space is located on the lot. So if that open space can be located in setbacks, one of the depending where your open space goals are in your contiguous open space, but a lot of people get scared when they see smaller lots because it looks denser, even though it's the same number of housing units. So in Rick's example, I think there was 18 homes on each of the scenarios, but the cluster subdivision or conservation subdivision, they're closer together. So it seems like they're denser. And so that kind of puts people off. So one of the things you can do is push the homes further back away from the roadway. So you're preserving those open space views from the main roadway. And then you only see the homes once you get into the neighborhood. That's one of the ways where you can still create a really beautiful community that still retains that rural character when you're passing by on the main roadway. So there's a lot of things that you can kind of work in here about specifics. And one of the other key things I wanted to mention is that you really need to be careful to make sure that your ordinance language agrees between your subdivision and land development ordinance and your zoning ordinance, because we all have, I call them Frankenstein ordinances, because we've all have ordinances that have been updated over the years, and sometimes one is updated and sometimes the other isn't. So then you have conflicting definitions of what actually is stormwater management. Is it all above ground features, or does it also include below ground features? So if you don't have, or if you have conflicting language in your code and in your definition section, especially, and in, what is lot area? How is that defined? Sometimes you have inconsistencies across your ordinances, and developers are able to take that inconsistency and tweak it to their advantage, which results in a community outcome that wasn't what the municipality intended through their ordinances. So it's very, very important to make sure that everything agrees across the board, that everything is defined in a way that you can measure it, that achieves the actual goals that you want, and then create the specifics. So if you want homes to front onto open space, you need to say that in your ordinance, and you need to be clear and measurable about that. If you want to exclude areas, because often what we see is the open space areas just kind of go around the perimeter of the lot, which kind of feels privatized, and without any sort of public access into that area, it just feels like an extension of a private backyard. So if you want to exclude those areas, or if you want to say the open space has to contain a minimum of, some percentage of open space situated in this location on a lot, or 10% of your open space has to have a recreational component. So Karen, to your question about how do you get trails in these developments, you can require a certain percentage of your open space to contain recreational amenities, and then the definition of recreational amenities would include trails. It could also include tot lots. It could include picnic tables and gazebos. Those in particular aren't very well, I think, used by the community. I think trails are the way that we're hoping to go and are beneficial. And then if you can get them open to the public, if they're not private trails, then of course they're servicing the broader community. And then again, just to not to, beat the drum again, but again, be very specific. So using specific language. So I often see in municipal codes things like, you must preserve heritage trees to the greatest extent possible. Well, that's very not measurable. You can't measure to the greatest extent possible because there can always be some sort of extenuating circumstance that can be argued. So again, try to avoid using kind of wishy-washy language. If there's a specific measurable outcome you want, include specific measurable language to achieve that. And always remember, scenic beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So when we have language that says preserve scenic views and preserve scenic landscapes, you need to be very clear about what those are. You can include them on a map. You can specify how to define them and what needs to be preserved, because without that specific language, it's very hard to have a developer agree with what I think municipalities envision for these communities. So this is a way to help you get the desired outcome through, again, very clear, very defined, very specific, and very measurable ordinance language.
Thank you, Maggie. Any more questions from the group or discussion? I want to thank all of the speakers, and this session is recorded and will be shared on the CCATO website and shared with partners as well. So I want to thank everyone. If anyone would like to get a hold of the individual speakers, Rick at Natural Lands, Rachel Griffith at the county, Maggie Dobbs at Westtown Township, and Karen Nocella at East Coventry. So thank you, everybody.